So in the second part of this lecture, we will see how now to use all this in practice, and how we can combine modules, losses, and autograd functions to build large-scale models in PyTorch. So everything we need is actually in torch.nn mostly, and we are going to see 5 main components to build the first neural network. So PyTorch provides a large collection of functions and modules which are pre-designed, and most of the time you don't need more than that. You should be able to virtually implement any state-of-the-art model using only those predefined elements. So there are 2 big subfamilies of elements we are going to consider today. So first are the elements from torch.nn.functional, which are autograd complex functions, which mean that they are really like mathematical functions or usual PyTorch functions, except that they work on variables, and that all the autograd machinery will be usable with them. And the second thing are the subclasses of torch.nn.modules, which are both losses and the network components. So network components are elements which embed torch.nn.parameters. So it means that they can be tuned during training. So you can combine them into a large scale, into a graph, and then do end-to-end training. Sorry. So the first element, the first point to note is that all those things only process variables. So if you want to use tensors, you will always have to first wrap them into variables. And in what follows, I will tend to mix, to use the English word tensor for both tensors and variables. It's quite hard. Variables are so similar to tensors in practice, semantic is virtually the same, that it's very hard to remain that we are not dealing with tensors. So don't be surprised if there is this use of this term for both objects. So second important point is that both functions and modules from torch.nn process only batches of inputs stored in a tensor, which means that there is always an additional index in your tensors that stands for the sample index. So for instance, if we build a fully connected layer that processes vectors of dimension C and produce vectors of dimension D, such a layer would actually expect as an input not a vector of dimension C, but a 2D tensor n times C, where n is the number of samples, and C is indeed the dimension of those samples. So those are raw vectors. And it would produce a tensor similarly of 2 dimensions, where you have n rows corresponding to the n input rows, and the dimension would be the output dimension. Okay, so the first element that we need to build our network is ReLU. So it's torch.nn.function.relu, which takes one parameter. So actually there is this in place that we'll come back to. But it takes a tensor as input and basically simply applies ReLU on each component separately. So this function actually does not care about the shape of the tensor. It just works component-wise and applies applies ReLU. So in practice, if I define a variable on the tensor of dimension 2, 5, I fill it with Gaussian noise, I get those values. And now if I apply torch.nn.function.relu, I get a corresponding variable which is of same size, but now has zeros instead of the negative value. So in place argument, which is a Boolean flag, allows to state that the operation should change the tensor passed as parameter. So it would actually modify x if we had passed in place equal true. It may be useful if you want tight control of the memory footprint in inference, because since the signals, the activations move forward, it may make sense not to generate new ones, but simply to modify the one that you already have in memory. So now I'm going to describe the pooling on the convolution layers, the pooling operation convolution layers. And for this, I need to introduce 2 additional parameters of those operations that I have not described yet. One is the padding that allows to add zeros around the inputs, both in 1D and 2D. on the stride, which allows to specify that the convolution should not be done at every location, but on a coarser grid, so moving by more than one element at each time. So, for instance, on this example, imagine that we have a tensor of 3 lines and 3 rows and 5 columns. We see channels, but we don't visualize the channels here. A padding of 2, 1 would mean a padding of 2 rows at the top and the bottom and 1 column at the left and the right. So it would change the shape of the tensor that we are going to produce, that we are going to process. Sorry. That way, it would add a bunch of zeros around the original tensor. And if we specify a stride of 2 on 2, it means that we are going not to move the filter at every location, but we are going to move by 2 columns on 2 rows at every computation. So now in practice, this is the filter. If we compute the convolution with, or if we move a kernel of size 3 by 3, instead of generating a final tensor of size so 5 plus 2 minus 3 plus 1, so which will be 5 columns, and if we keep the original size of 3 rows, we would, on the filter of size 3, we would get a single row as output. Here, remember, we first add the padding around, and then we move by 2, which means that we have only 3 positions for the kernel horizontally and 3 positions of the kernel vertically. So now the output is 3 by 3 one channel, because the input tensor and the filter have the same number of channels, so the filter, it's a 2D term convolution, and we get an output of one channel 3 by 3. Okay. So now we can make more precise the difference between pooling and convolution in terms of moving around, and how do they, so to make precise that the pooling operations do not overlap while the convolution by default do. So it's simply that the pooling operations have a default stride of equal to their kernel size, which means that the kernel, the position of the kernel do not overlap, and by default the convolutions have a default size of 1, which means that they are done densely in the input tensor. The padding is 0 by default, so by default you process the tensor as it is, but it's quite useful in particular to generate an output of the same size as the input. So in many situations you have, say, a filter of 5 by 5, which means you are going to lose 4 columns and 4 rows and 4 columns. So by adding a padding of 2, you would keep exactly the same size. And in certain networks, it's what you want to have. You want to keep the size of the tensor that move forward the same. Okay, so now that we have defined those 2 parameters, we can look at the torch-NN function.maxPool 2D, which gets an input tensor, a kernel size, a stride, and a padding. And then there are additional ones, even more, that we won't describe here, but there are so many variations around pooling and convolution that I can't detail everything. I can't go into every single detail, so I encourage you to look at the documentation and to look at dilation. We'll come back to dilation a little bit later. So these functions take as input a tensor, as I said before, which is a bunch of samples, so n time number of channels time height time width, a kernel size hw, which the kernel size can also be a single integer, in which case it is interpreted as a pair of the same integer. It is interpreted as a square filter. And this function is going to apply the max pooling on each channel of each sample separately, and produce if the padding is 0, n times c time. So this is the smallest integer smaller than the ceiling value, because the floor value, sorry, because it may happen that the input tensor is not a multiple of the filter size. So here, an example, I build a tensor of 1 sample, 2 channels, 3 rows, 6 columns, filled with random values between 0 and 2. And if I do the max pooling with a kernel size 1, 2, 1 row, 2 columns, what we do is that we keep the number of channels and the number of lines, because we do the max pooling over a single line. But since we do the max pooling over 2 pairs of columns, this 2 is the max of those 2 values. This 1 here is the max of these 2 values. etc. This one here is the max of those two values. Okay, so it strictly does what we expect it to do. Now we have the first module with parameters, which is the fully connected layer. So it's torch.nn.linear, and it takes the constructor takes. So this is actually an object. You have to construct it. It's not a function like what we have seen before for max pooling and for ReLU. So you have to specify the number, the input dimension, the output dimension, and also if it has biases or not. So by default it does, and it implements a fully connected layer. So here I build one. I build the F, which is a fully connected layer with 10 dimensions as input and 4 dimensions as output. We can look a little bit inside. We see that there is indeed a weight matrix, which is 4 by 10, and a bias vector, which is 4. All this makes a lot of sense. And when we build, if we build a tensor of 523 samples of dimension 10, fill them with normal with Gaussian noise, we can apply f to x. We can call build this module and use it with a functional call as if it was a function. And what we get is a variable, a tensor of size 523, same number of samples, but the dimension now goes from 10 to 4 as expected by the definition of the fully connected layer. A quite important point is that the weights and biases are automatically randomized at creation. We will come back to that later because it's quite an important piece of an important detail to take care of to make all this work. By default, PyTorch does very well. So by default, you can trust PyTorch to do what it should do. Now we have the convolution, the 2D convolution layer, which similarly the constructor takes how many channels as input, how many channels as output. Remember that this is a number of filters because every filter will be of the same number of channels as this guy. So every filter will produce a single channel. So this says I want this number of filters that will produce this number of channels. And as for the pooling, kernel size, the stride by default 1, padding by default 0, and again there are other things, dilation groups. And as for the fully connected, you can state if you want a bias or not. By default you do have one. And again, it's quite reasonable. The kernel size is either a pair HW or a single LK, which is interpreted as K, comma K, which is a square filter. And this such a module takes as input n times c times HIW tensor, which is a bunch of tensors which are multi-channel 2D structures, and it will produce the same number of samples. D is going to be the number of out channels, which is the number of filters you are going to convolve the input signal with, and you are going to lose the 2D size of the tensor will be reduced by the filter size plus 1, which makes sense. Will be reduced by the filter size minus 1, which gives you a plus 1. So now, in practice, here I define such a layer. I say it's a convolution layer that takes 4 channels as input, produce 5 channels as input. That's the kernel of size 2 by 3. I can look at the weight. So this maybe needs a bit of attention. So the weight tensor in the convolution layer, the first is the number of filters. And since we want 5 channels as output, this is the number of filters we have. Remember the figure for the convolution in the previous part of the lecture. We had this number of blocks. We had 2, one for green, one for red. Here it's 5, so it produces 5 channels as output. This is the number of input channels. So this is the number of channels in the tensor we will get as input to the convolution layer. And this is the filter size. We stated that it was 2 by 3, so each filter has 2 rows and 3 columns. The bias, because by default bias is true, it takes this tensor exists, and we have 1 bias per filter. Since we have 5 filters, we have 5 bias. So now I can create a tensor of 117 samples, 4 channels, 10 rows, 3 columns, fill with Gaussian noise, and if I apply my layer, what do I get? 117 samples, 5 channels, because I stated that I wanted 5 channels, and indeed I had 5 filters. On 9 by 1, because the kernel size being 2 by 3, we lose 1 dimension, 1 row, and we lose 2 columns. So 10 become 9 and 3 become 1. Okay. And as for the fully connected layer, weights and biases are randomized. So now we can look a bit more graphically what this layer does. So here what I do is I first load NIST. Then I pick the 12th sample, convert it to float, and shape it as a tensor of a single sample, one channel 2828. Now I create a convolution layer that takes a single channel as input and produce 5 channels with kernel of size 3,3. I set the bias to 0, and I actually fill my my filters by hand because I want to show what the convolutions look like. So the first filter is going to be zeros everywhere but 1 in the center. Second filter is going to be 1s everywhere. Third filter is going to be -1 the first column, 0 in the center, and 1 on the right column, etc. Okay. Now I create a variable from x, I apply f, and I get back data. So here in y, I'm going to get a tensor, a real tensor, not a variable, which is built by feeding x as a variable in the module and retrieving the data itself. And now I have this utility function that I don't describe, but allows me to save images in a color way. So here, because this guy is 5 channels, I wrote this fancy function that produces PNG images. Now we can look at the result. So if I convert the first filter with the original image, so here I need color code for the sign because I'm going to have negative filters. Red is full red is 1, full blue is -1, 0 is white. So on the shades of between red and blue correspond to different values in the -1, 1 bracket. We see that if I convert this by that, because it's zeros everywhere, I just lose two rows and 2 columns, but otherwise I keep the image exactly the same, because if you put the filter somewhere, the convolution between this filter and the signal will be equal to the center value, the pixel, the center of the pixel, so I'm just picking 1 pixel, so the image remains unchanged. If I convolve with this filter which is flat, actually I renormalize by the max, so here I should multiply by 9, but whatever. But in practice this can be seen as a filter which is larger than, does the same but with a larger size, which does a kind of a blurring. It's like a hollow band filter. If I do this, so if I convolve with a filter which is -1, 0, and 1, what happens is that, imagine for instance if the filter is over there, so start to enter the digit, touch a little bit the digit on the left, you will get the positive value of the digit times the negative value of the filter, and you will get a negative response. Now if you completely overlap, you get 0, because the image will be multiplied by -1 on one side plus 1 on the other, and so it will make 0. And if you are on the other side, because the image will be multiplied by the positive part of the filter, you will get a positive response. So we are quite happy because we get some kind of signed edge, vertical edge detector. Same for the horizontal one. And now if I have this filter with a +1 in the middle and the minus values around, I get a kind of the interior detector, a second order filter that responds when we are inside the digit positively and negative when we are at the boundary. So this gives you a kind of an intuition of what convolution of images can do. It can do nothing, blurring, edge detection, or more sophisticated second order detection. The last element we miss is the loss to train the network. So the most standard one is the mean square error. And the semantic is quite simple. So this module simply computes sum the square difference between two tensors, two variables, and just divide by the total number of components, which means that it both averages across dimensions, channels, and samples. So for instance, here I define such a loss. So f is torch.nn-msc loss. I define two tensors of a single element, and now if I compute the mean square error of those two guys, because there is a single element, it's 3 square minus 0 square. 3 minus 0 square, it's 9. And if I have 4 elements, it will be 3 minus 0 square, 9 divided by 4 is 2.25. Okay. So by the usage is that the first element of a loss is the input and the second is the target. And these two quantities may be of different dimensions or even different types. For instance, for classification, we'll see certain losses where the input is going to be a vector of scores, 1 score per class, and the target is an index which is the correct class. So again, maybe it's worth reminding this, that modules, inputs and outputs are expected to be variables. So if you want to send a tensor through such a module for whatever reasons, you have to first wrap it into a variable before forwarding it to a module. So here, for instance, I import touch vision and I get mist. And let's say I want to apply a linear transformation to my samples. If I directly take the cast elements from NIST as a tensor, not a variable, and send it through a linear layer, I get this mistake. It must be a variable, not a float tensor. So now if I say that x is a torch autograd variable of x, now x is a variable, I can do this. And conversely, sometimes you may be puzzled at first, because then we get used to it. Results are also always variables, of course, which means that, for instance, if you compute a loss and you want to use it as a float, for instance, to use it with standard Python code, you have to retrieve the value. So you have to get back the value from the tensor in the variable. So for instance, here I define the L1 loss, I compute the distance between two tensors. What I get is not a float, it's not even a tensor of size 1, it's a variable containing a float tensor of size 1 and one value, which is 2. And if I want to access to it as a float, I would have to do u.data to access the tensor in the variable, bracket 0 to access the coefficient in the tensor. Another thing that may be surprising sometimes is that criteria, so losses, do not compute the gradient with respect to the target, which means that if the second argument of a loss cannot have requires grad 2 true as the target. So for instance, here I define two tensors, states that I will need the gradient for both. If I send it through MSE loss, I get the following error. Don't compute explicitly, don't compute the gradient with respect to target. If you really need it, you have to rewrite it from scratch. So you could say x minus y dot power 2 dot sum dot mean, sorry, and you would get basically the same stuff. Okay, one more last detail before doing the actual network. The mean square error. So the only loss we saw was the mean square error, and we are going to use it to train a classification network, even though MSE is more designed for regression. So to do this, to use the mean square error for a classification problem, given a training set, which is a classification training set, so we have the x is whatever feature vector, image, or whatever, and the target is a class. What we do is to build so-called one hot vector for every from every xn, yn, sorry, where so we are going to build a tensor with as many rows as samples, as many columns as classes, and in each row corresponds to a sample, and in each row everybody will be -1 except the proper index corresponding to the right column corresponding to the proper class of this sample, which is going to be 1. So for instance, if this is my original target vector, which is a bunch of indexes, first sample is of class 2, second sample is of class 1, third sample is of class 1, fourth sample is of class 3, etc. I'm going to create a matrix like this where I'm stating that second column is 1, first column is 1. There is always this ambiguity. I'm always conflicted between starting indexes at 0 like in Python or at 1 like in math, and I realize it's sometimes a bit inconsistent, but here I number my classes at 1, and I number my columns at 1 because this is mathematics. But of course in Python this would be 1, this would be 0, 0, 2, and 1. I'm sorry for this. Computer scientists should have synchronized with mathematicians early instead of letting this get out of hand. In practice, so now if you do you train your network to match this output in regression, so to produce a bunch of scores where basically the proper class is has a response close to 1 and the incorrect classes are close to -1, this gives quite good results actually. And there is even the argument that often when you fine-tune a classification network, you should use a loss like this and not a specifically for classification loss. One more technical detail before we actually build the network is that, as we saw, convolutional and being layers take a 3 tensor channel height, width as input and produce a similarly shaped tensor, similarly 3D. So if at some point you need to move your signal, your activations from such a layer, convolution or pooling, into a fully connected, you have to reshape it because a fully connected layer expect to have a 1D samples. So actually, because they process batches, a 2D tensor where the first index is a sample number and the second index is a dimension. So in practice, for instance, if I have a sample from NIST, so I'm loading again full NIST, I reshape, so this would be the shape of the tensor that would be sent to a fully connected, to a convolution layer, 60,000, one channel 2828. If you want to move it, to give it as input to a linear layer, you would have to do a trick like this. You would have to say x equal x.view. I keep the number of samples and I have only one dimension and pick the dimension as you see fit so that it's correct. So PyTorch should automatically select 784 because this is the only way to equalize the number of coefficients. Okay, so now we have everything we need. We have ReLU, max pooling, convolution layers, fully connected layers, and MS loss, error. So we can build a very standard convolution network for NIST classification, which has two convolutional layers and two fully connected layers. So here I'm going to describe the processing for a single sample. So the input size and number of operations for a single sample, and write the code to write the form of the constructors to build the different modules. So we first get as input an image from NIST is a one channel 2828, and we first send it through a convolution layer that goes from one channel to 32. Those are quite standard values that have been, which are the result of years and years of testing by many people. So we keep standard values, but you are plenty free to try others if you want. So here this first layer gets one channel, produce 32 channel on the run kernel of size 5. So we have 32 filters because we produce 32 channels. We have 32 filters of size 5, each of them has a bias. So the total number of parameters is 32 times 26, which is 832. And it's interesting to remark that the number, so we produce a tensor of 32 channels 24, 24, which means that the filters can be moved at 24, 24 locations. So the total number of float products would be, for each one of the 32 filters, I have to move it at 24 square locations, and every time I have to do 25 multiplications, which means that simply sending an image, a one channel image 2828, through such a layer, which is really not something particularly impressive, will require 500,000 floating point products. Then I apply max pooling, so with the kernel size 3, which means that I divide, remember, the max pooling is over non-overlapping blocks, which means I really divide by 3 in both directions, in the rows and the columns, so I get 3288. Max pooling has no parameters, because it's an operation which is not parameterized, and number of weight is 0. Then I apply ReLU. ReLU maintains the size of the tensor, so you get 32 channel 88, number of parameters 0, number of products 0. Then I send this again into a convolution layer. I get 30 channels as input because this is what I have so far. I decide to produce 64 channels and to do the convolution with kernel of size 5. We get 64 channels for 4. So remember, the size goes down by the kernel size minus 1. Here the kernel size is 5, so we lose 4 rows and 4 columns. So 32 becomes 64 due to the specification of the layer to do so. And the size goes from 8 to 4 because we stated that the kernel was a square of size 5. Here the number of parameters explodes because we have 32 channels as input, 64 as output, which means we have 64 filters, each of them 3255 because it's convolved with 32 channels as input on a single bias, so we have 51,264 parameters. The number of operations, I let you do the math, is now close to 1 million for this layer alone on a single sample. Max pooling again, ReLU again, and now we are at a point where classically we decide it's enough and we can do fully connected classification. So we have a tensor of 64 channels 2 by 2, so it's a tiny image, it's really an image only 2 by 2. In 2D it's a degenerated 2D signal. and we reshape it as a 256. So here doing this, philosophically, we lose the image structure. We just say, okay, whatever, now I have 256 values that I consider carry enough information. I apply a fully connected layer, ReLU, fully connected layer. So number of hidden units in the first fully connected, or the output of the first fully connected is 200 dimensions. And then in the end, I need 10 scores because this is MNIST, which has 10 classes, so I want to get a score per class. And we can look at the number of parameters. So a standard fully connected layer has, for every output, a bias and a vector to do the dot product with the input. So it's 256 plus 1 times 200, 50,000. And the last layer goes from 200 to 10, so 2,000. So the total number of parameters of such a very small network is 100,000 parameters. And what I find quite surprising and impressive is that, impressive in a bad sense, is that processing such a small sample into such a simple network costs 1.5 million float products. Which means that now we see why we need those GPUs, because if you are going to do this thousands and millions of times during training, you see that it quickly accumulates. The good news is that a standard GPU is more in the 10,000 billions operations per second, so which means you can push 10,000 of those guys per second, but still 10,000 per second is not so huge. Okay, so we are happy. We saw all the elements to create our network. So now let's actually create our network, and we are going to create it as a module, as a PyTorch module. So to create a module, one has to inherit from the base class and implement the constructor on the forward path. The constructor, because for any class you have to build a constructor, but what truly matters is the forward. So this is exactly the implementation of what we described. So let's look at forward first. Forward is the operation that when you do the functional call over a module, so remember we did something like f parenthesis x, where f was a module, a convo layer or fully connected layer. When you do this, when you do f parenthesis x, when you apply, when you use your module as a function, it's actually this which is called. And additional stuff, but at this order, at the first order, it's what happens. When you do f of x, and f is a module, you're actually calling forward of x plus additional little machinery, PyTorch machinery. But so what matters is to implement this thing. What happens when I send an X into my network? And what happens is really what I described. I'm going to apply a convolution layer, which is defined in the constructor, but I apply convolution layers, and I apply max pooling, and I do ReLU. And do it again. And then I reshape. Remember, to go from a convolution layer or pooling layer into a fully connected, we have to make the signal each sample 1D on the batch tensor 2D. So here, because I know that my signal is 256 dimension, I put -1 for the number of samples and let PyTorch figure it out. Then I apply ReLU, so the fully response. I apply the fully connected and then ReLU, and then I apply the second fully connected, and I get my response. And now the elements, the modules of the submodules of my network that contains parameters, which are this guy, this guy, this guy, and this guy, they are defined in the constructor, because when I create my module, I want to create all the submodules it uses, which have their own parameters. So there is plenty of memory allocation, initialization of what's going on. And it's what happens in the constructor. I describe that first convolution layer is 1 channel, 32 channel output, kernel size 5. Second, the convolution layer is 32 channel input, 64 channel output, kernel size 5. First fully connected is 256 to 200. Second fully connected is 200 to 10. The thing is that those guys actually do not really care about the size of the tensor as long as it has the right dimensions. What happens is that when you reach this point, so when you reach here, if you don't feed this network with proper size image, 2820 channel, some weird stuff may happen, because now, because you're forced to have 256 dimension, if by chance your bug, what you got here, so if you feed an image which is not 2828, when you reach this point, you don't have the expected 256 dimension per sample, and when you do the reshape, the view, some weird stuff happens, and then it can blow in your face. So here there is this, and it's often the case, almost always the case for standard convolution networks. There is a strong assumption that about the size of the initial input that maintain everything consistent. And now the miracle of PyTorch and AutoGrad is that because we are using only AutoGrad compliant operations everywhere, so on the convolution layer, max pooling, etc., all this stuff can be used with the backward pass and the gradient descent and everything. So we did not do anything specific related to the backward pass, but simply because we use only AutoGrad compliant operations, the backward pass is implemented automatically. So this is the constructor, this is the forward pass. Okay, some technical details. A very important method that is used in training is module.parameters. That actually is an iterator over the parameters of the module. And when you create a new module and you add field in the class which are modules, the PyTorch machinery automatically detects this, and then when you will call this guy at the level of your network, it will naturally go through all the parameters of all the submodules and recursively, etc. So here I've done this in my constructor. If I now create an instantiation of my model, if I loop through this iterator model.parameters and I print the size, I see that everything is consistent. So I first so it will loop through all those tensors, so all those variables, all those parameters of this size. Those two guys are the parameter of this guy. So 32 filters, one channel input, 5 by 5, 32 bias. Then second convolution layer, 64 filters that take 32 channels as input, 5 by 5, 64 bias, fully connected, 256 as input, 200 as output, 200 bias, 200 as input, 10 as output, 10 bias. So everything is fine. If you add parameters as attributes, they are also seen as module parameters. But when you have to be careful is that if you add explicitly parameters or modules in dictionaries, bad stuff may happen, because here, for instance, I'm creating a dictionary and I add submodules to my model through it, because it may happen that it makes sense. So the problem is that it would be asking a bit too much to parameters to be able to do recursively into arbitrary structure. So it will not do this. It will not, because that would be crazy to do so. It will not visit all the dictionaries or all whatever exotic structure you have in your class, in your instance of class, to find all the modules. So if we do this guy is added as a field and is seen as being module, so PyTorch is smart enough to find the parameters. Here, if I add explicitly parameters, they are seen again. So PyTorch is able to find the fields which are modules and parameters, but this is nowhere to be seen because PyTorch has no idea that it's somewhere. So if you want to do this kind of thing where you want to add field in a weird manner, either you can use add modules. So here I do it explicitly. I add a module and then it's seen. And you can access them with get attribute. You can also register parameter explicitly, which will do the same. Another strategy that I prefer, and I think it's encouraged to do so, is to use an module list, which is simply a list of modules, and which PyTorch will visit when you do parameters. So here I'm adding those guys, and then the parameters are visible when I go through the parameters. We come back finally on batch processing. So what we saw is that all the Tor.nn elements process sample by batches, which means that every time you have an input of a certain dimension, the tensor you actually feed to a Torch.nn component will be a tensor with one more dimension, where the first index is sample index. And we can revisit a little bit what we saw for the expressions for multi-layer perceptron, because it changes a little bit the way we compute the activations. So this is the activations after the matrix product, and this is before the matrix product. So what we saw until now was really some standard linear algebra notation, where those two guys are column vector, and this is a matrix, so you multiply on the left. So a column vector times a matrix on its left give you a column vector. Now what we want is to store the vectors in rows, so a batch will be a 2D tensor where the first index, so the row is the sample index, which means that each sample is a row vector, which can be seen as a bunch of transpose of column vector. And now, if you look at the resulting row vector after the matrix product, it's the transpose of the matrix product of the transpose of the row vector, because this is now a column, all this is a column, and when you retranspose, you get a row. And now, transpose of AB is transpose B transpose A, so you get this expression. And what we see is that a linear layer actually is going to multiply, because it gets a 2D tensor where the first index is the sample index, it's going to actually multiply by the transpose of the weight matrix on the right instead of multiplying by the weight matrix on the left. And this holds for the full batch. So now you can do in one shot, if you get a 2D tensor with one sample per row, you multiply by the weight matrix on the right, or the transpose of the weight matrix on the right, you get a 2D tensor with one sample per row. And if we look at the actual implementation in PyTorch, so this is probably a previous version because there are constant updates, so I cannot promise it's still like that, but at some point it was like this at some point in the past. So they do some fancy tests, probably because they are able either to process individual samples, which they do not promise they can do, but maybe in this implementation they did, but whatever. Here they check that if they get a tensor input of dimension 2, and they have actually bias, they are using this fancy operation that does input time weight transpose plus bias. So it's like exactly what I wrote here. This is X, this is W, and you actually compute X times W transpose. Okay. For the backward, it's the same stuff. Instead of multiplying by the weight, transpose the weight on the left, now we transpose by the weight on the right. Remember that now we still keep the tensorial operation, which means that now the derivative of the loss with respect to the activations is actually a 2D matrix because this activation is a 2D matrix, so the transpose of the derivative of the loss with respect to the activation is also 2D matrix, but everything holds, so those expressions are valid. Okay. So now why all this insistence on batch processing? It's because it's key in making things go fast. So here I have a little piece of code where I compare the speed of multiplying by a weight matrix by batch or using a loop. So I have this little function that I wrote that gets a bunch of samples stored in a 2D tensor, so a bunch of row vectors, a weight matrix, and the number of times we want to do the measurement of the speed so that we can average and get a more accurate estimate. So here I loop, I'm going to define a tensor to store my measurement, and what I do is that I loop as many times as there are values in this vector, which is 51 by default, and what I do is I define a counter, perf counter, I multiply I use here the batch processing, so I multiply my vector of activation or my input vector on its right by the transpose of the weight, and I get my output vector. Here there is something to be careful with, which is that, and it may surprise you if sometimes you do measurement of speed, there is some asynchronicity going on. If you start a computation on the GPU, you get back, your CPU can go on working even if the processing is not finished in the GPU. Why? Because somehow you don't need here the result of the GPU operation. So PyTorch is smart enough that it gives you back, you can continue working while stuff is still being done on the GPU. So here I explicitly state that if this is a CUDA tensor, which means if we are indeed processing on the GPU, I call torch.CUDA synchronize, which hopefully is going to wait until it's done. This is not so clear, so I had some exchange with both the PyTorch developers and some NVIDIA guy, and it's not so clear that you can actually synchronize so easily, but so far, well, it's good enough for what I want to show here. So again, we loop 51 times, I start a time counter, I do my batch product, and I keep track in T of the number of seconds which was passed during the computation. And then at the end of the loop, I just compute the median. And then I do the same stuff with the loop. So here it's exactly the same piece of code, but instead of Here I was doing y equal xmm w transpose, which means in one operation I was doing the batch processing. I was multiplying all the rows of x by w, and here I do it one by one. So every time I compute the kth row of y as a product between w and so here there is the yk for PyTorch is a column vector, so now I can multiply on the left. But bottom line, in the end I'm going to print the speed it took by batch and the speed it took, the ratio of the speed it took by batch and by one by one with a loop. And I compare the speed on the CPU and the speed on the GPU, and what we see is quite impressive, because processing by batch, so it's a huge batch because I have 2,500 samples in this tensor, but still the CPU was 10 times faster when I was doing the processing by batch, and the GPU is 80 times faster when you do the processing by batch. So this explains why we are so insistent on doing batch processing and why it's the standard, because you can really have close to 2 orders of magnitude speed up by doing batch processing. Okay, so this is all for today. The practical is there, and again, I'm very happy to do all this. I hope it's useful, and if you have any question, drop me a mail. I'm always plenty happy to answer. See you. Bye.